Have you ever wondered why some people seem to prefer solitude over intense social interaction? Why, while many constantly seek social events, parties, gatherings, and crowds, others, often the most reflective and conscious, seem to avoid these environments? Maybe you identify with this second group and have questioned whether something is wrong with you, whether you should force yourself to socialize more, to enjoy parties, to dive into the agitation of crowds, as so many around you seem to do so easily. The truth is that there is a deep connection between high levels of consciousness and a preference for solitude or more intimate and meaningful social interactions. It is not about misanthropy or social inadequacy, but a fundamental characteristic of human consciousness in its more expanded states, a characteristic rooted both in our evolutionary history and in the particular configurations of the human brain. Today, we will explore this relationship and understand why the most conscious people often feel drained in socially intense environments, and why this is not a flaw to be corrected, but a valuable characteristic to be understood and honored. Historically, humanity lived most of its existence in small groups. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in bands of hunter-gatherers with no more than 150 people, the famous Dunbar number, which represents the approximate cognitive limit of individuals with whom we can maintain stable social relationships. In these small groups, each interaction had meaning and purpose. You knew every person by name, knew their story, their talents, their peculiarities. Communication was direct, contextualized, relevant. When your cousin talked about a successful hunt, it had immediate implications for the group's survival. When a young woman talked about her discoveries of medicinal plants, it could save lives in the near future. When an elder told stories around the fire, he transmitted essential knowledge for the survival and cultural cohesion of the group. Every conversation, every social exchange carried meaning, purpose, and direct relevance for everyone involved. All of this began to change with the agricultural revolution about 12,000 years ago. As humans settled in permanent villages, then in cities, and eventually in metropolises, the size and complexity of our social networks grew exponentially. Suddenly, we were surrounded by strangers, people we knew nothing about, with whom we shared no stories or meaningful connections. And yet, our brains, shaped by millions of years of evolution in small groups, continued to function as if every person around us were a significant member of our tribe. This mismatch between our evolutionary programming and our social reality created a constant stress that manifests in different ways in different people. For many, this stress manifests as social anxiety, a constant feeling of judgment and evaluation. For others, it creates an almost compulsive need to please, to conform, to seek social validation. And for a third group, those with higher levels of self-awareness and sensitivity, it manifests as rapid exhaustion in socially intense environments, a discomfort relieved only by returning to solitude or to very small social circles. But what exactly do we mean by more conscious people? I am not talking here only about intelligence or formal education, although these factors may contribute. I am referring to a more fundamental quality of human experience, the ability to be fully present, to observe both the external world and one's own mental processes with clarity and without excessive judgment. Highly conscious people tend to perceive more nuances in their environment and in their own emotional reactions. They notice subtle details in facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language that other people may completely ignore. They feel subtle changes in their own internal state, fluctuations of mood and energy that pass unnoticed by others. This expanded awareness has enormous advantages. It allows for a deeper understanding of oneself and others, facilitates genuine connections, and enables creative and intuitive insights. But it also comes with a price. In socially intense and chaotic environments, these people receive far more information than they can comfortably process. Imagine that your consciousness is like a flashlight. Most people have flashlights that illuminate a relatively narrow cone in front of them. They clearly see what is directly in their field of attention, but little beyond that. Highly conscious people, on the other hand, have flashlights that illuminate in all directions simultaneously. In a calm environment, this is wonderful. It allows for a rich and multifaceted appreciation of experience. But in a loud party or a crowd, it is like trying to watch 100 televisions at the same time, all on different channels with the volume at maximum. Sensory overload is inevitable and quickly exhausting. This explains, in part, why highly conscious people tend to avoid socially intense environments. It is not that they dislike people or are antisocial. On the contrary, many of them deeply value authentic and meaningful interpersonal connections. What they avoid is not people themselves, but contexts that make genuine connections almost impossible due to the overload of stimuli and the often superficial nature of social interactions in large groups. A highly conscious person may have a deep and energizing conversation for hours with a close friend, but feel exhausted after 20 minutes at a loud party where they are forced into superficial conversations with multiple people simultaneously. Modern technology has intensified this phenomenon. We live in the most connected era in human history. The internet and social media allow us to interact with hundreds or even thousands of people daily, far beyond Dunbar's limit. We receive constant notifications, messages, updates, comments, likes. Each digital interaction demands a small portion of our attention and emotional energy. For highly conscious people, this constant bombardment of social stimuli can be particularly exhausting. They feel not only the need to respond, but to respond authentically and meaningfully, something that becomes impossible when the volume of interactions exceeds our fundamental human capacity. In addition, the modern culture of spectacle and social performance amplifies the discomfort. Social networks like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook have created an environment where each social interaction potentially becomes a performance for an invisible audience. We are not just interacting with the people in front of us, but imagining how those interactions will be perceived by others who may see photos, videos, or accounts later. This additional layer of self-awareness and performance makes social interactions even more draining for people who are already naturally very aware of themselves and their surroundings. Every party is not just a party, but an opportunity to be photographed, filmed, evaluated, compared. Each interaction is not just a moment of human connection, but potential content for social media. For someone who already naturally processes many details and emotional nuances, this additional pressure can make modern social events simply unbearable. There is also an emotional sincerity factor to consider. Highly conscious people tend to value authenticity and congruence between their internal feelings and external expression. In many modern social contexts, especially those with many people, there is implicit pressure to maintain a facade of happiness and carefreeness, regardless of how we actually feel. Demonstrating enthusiasm, even when we do not genuinely feel it, is practically a social obligation at parties, corporate events, and many other social contexts. For people who value emotional sincerity, this mismatch between internal experience and external expression creates constant discomfort, a subtle form of self-betrayal that accumulates over time and drains emotional resources. There is also the issue of depth versus breadth in social relationships. Research in psychology has consistently shown that deep and meaningful relationships are one of the main factors for long-term well-being and happiness. Superficial interactions with many different people simply do not provide the same emotional satisfaction as intimate and authentic conversations with a few close friends. Highly conscious people seem to intuit this truth and naturally prioritize depth over quantity in their social lives. They prefer to devote their limited time and emotional energy to nurturing a small number of meaningful relationships rather than dispersing it in superficial interactions with many different people. This is not a failure of social adaptation, but a psychologically healthy strategy that prioritizes quality over quantity, meaning over stimulation. The philosopher Martin Buber made a fundamental distinction that is relevant here. He spoke of two main types of relationships, I-it and I-thou. In the I-it relationship, we treat the other as an object, something to be used, categorized, manipulated for our ends. In the I-thou relationship, we meet the other as a full subject. We recognize their integral humanity, their irreducible otherness. Only in I-thou relationships do we experience true human connection. The problem is that many of our modern social interactions, especially in large groups, are predominantly I-it in nature. We socialize to network, to impress, to avoid being excluded, to fulfill social obligations. People become means to ends, not ends in themselves. Highly conscious people tend to feel this relational emptiness particularly acutely and naturally, seek contexts where genuine I-thou relationships are possible, typically in more intimate gatherings with a few people. There is also a neurobiological dimension to this preference. Neuroscience research has shown that approximately 15 to 20% of the population has a nervous system that is genetically more sensitive and reactive. These people, often called highly sensitive persons or HSPs, are more strongly affected by both positive and negative experiences. Their brains literally process information more deeply, notice more nuances, and respond more intensely to sensory stimuli. This trait has clear evolutionary advantages. Highly sensitive people often demonstrate greater empathy, creativity, and ability to detect subtle dangers. But it also means they reach the point of sensory saturation much faster in stimulating environments like loud parties or crowds. For these people, avoiding socially intense environments is not a whim or weakness, but a physiological self-regulation necessity as legitimate as an introvert's need for alone time to recharge. And this brings us to another important factor, introversion. Although introversion and high consciousness are not the same thing, there is significant overlap. Introversion, as defined by Jung and elaborated by modern researchers like Susan Cain, is not necessarily shyness or social ineptitude, but a psychological orientation where a person recharges energy in solitude and tends to lose energy in prolonged social interactions, especially with many people. It is estimated that between 30 to 50% of the population is primarily introverted, although our culture, especially in the West, is strongly biased toward valuing extroverted traits. Introverted and highly conscious people face a double challenge. They not only process more information in social environments, but also tend to become energetically drained more quickly in these contexts. For them, limiting time in large social groups is not a character flaw, but a wise recognition of their own psychological needs. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this discussion about consciousness and social preferences resonates most with your personal experience? Have you ever felt overwhelmed in intense social environments and then questioned whether something was wrong with you? I know that many of us keep these reflections to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming antisocial or not fitting into the extroverted ideal that our society values so much. But your experiences are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. I recognize myself in this discussion when your voice may help create a space where we can honestly discuss these experiences instead of suppressing or pathologizing them. And perhaps by sharing these reflections together, we can begin building a culture that equally honors different ways of being and existing in the social world. Another important factor to consider is the question of meaning and purpose in social interactions. Highly conscious people often have a strong need for meaning in their lives and activities. When they engage in conversations or interactions, they tend to seek exchanges that in some way contribute to their growth, understanding, or genuine connection. Many of the social activities in our culture, however, are structured around distraction, superficial entertainment, or simply passing time. There is nothing inherently wrong with these lighter forms of socialization, and they certainly have their place in a balanced life. But for someone who naturally gravitates toward depth and meaning, spending hours in conversations about the weather, celebrity gossip, or other superficial topics may feel not only boring, but existentially empty, a precious use of lifetime that could be dedicated to more meaningful exchanges or inner cultivation through solitude. This is a crucial and often misunderstood point. The preference for less time in socially intense environments does not necessarily mean less meaningful human connection. On the contrary, many highly conscious people cultivate deep friendships, intense, intimate relationships, and genuine connections with their community. What they avoid is not human connection per se, but specific forms of socialization that prioritize quantity over quality, stimulation over meaning, conformity over authenticity. Seen from this perspective, the tendency of these people to be selective about their social environments does not reflect a deficit, but an intuitive wisdom about what truly nourishes the human spirit. History offers us countless examples of highly conscious individuals who limited their exposure to large social groups to preserve their energy for meaningful, creative, or contemplative work. From spiritual hermits, such as the Desert Fathers and Mothers in the early centuries of Christianity, to artists like Emily Dickinson, Franz Kafka, Marcel Proust, philosophers like Wittgenstein, or scientists like Newton and Einstein, many of the brightest and most sensitive minds of humanity found it necessary to cultivate solitude and limit their social interactions. This did not prevent them from making profound contributions to human culture. On the contrary, this protection of their inner space and creative energy was often precisely what made those contributions possible. There is, however, a real danger in excessively romanticizing isolation or pathologizing the preference for more limited social interactions. Humans are ultimately social creatures. Even the most introverted and reflective people need meaningful human connection to flourish. Complete social isolation for long periods is harmful to virtually anyone. The question is not whether we need social connection, but what kind of social connection nourishes different types of people, in what dosage and in which contexts. For highly conscious people, the answer often involves less frequent but deeper interactions in environments with fewer sensory stimuli, with people with whom they can be completely authentic. Late modernity, with its emphasis on individualism, mobility, and digital technology, has created both challenges and opportunities for highly conscious people who prefer more limited social interactions. On one hand, the erosion of stable traditional communities means that many people now need to work more actively to cultivate and maintain meaningful connections. We can no longer simply rely on physical proximity and lasting family ties to provide social context, as our ancestors did for millennia. On the other hand, the same technology that fragmented traditional communities also allows people with similar sensitivities to find each other across great geographical